Comrades, the task of this lecture is to outline the historical experiences out of which the Trotskyist movement emerged as the sole continuation of Marxism, and introduce the basic political conceptions of Trotskyism, which were defended from 1953 onward in the struggle against Pabloism by the International Committee. We often stress that we are a party of history, but it is important to understand what approach to history underlies our work. We do not approach history subjectively. That is, we do not approach history from the standpoint of passing moral judgments on good or bad actions or motives of individuals. The task of Marxists is, in Engels's famous words, to uncover the motives behind the motives. That is, to establish the objective social driving forces behind the political thought and actions of tendencies and individuals. But this objective approach to history does not mean a passive approach. We approach history from the standpoint of revolutionary struggle. We understand the socialist revolution as a law-driven, but also as a dynamic process, which is critically shaped by the program, decisions, and actions of the revolutionary class and its party. This approach to history is intrinsically bound up with our conception of the imperialist epoch and the role of revolutionary leadership in the socialist revolution. In the wake of the Stalinist dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, three different conceptions of the 20th century were developed. The first, Francis Fukuyama's now infamous proclamation of the end of history, hardly requires detailed refutation. Comrades can see him here along with representatives of the neo-Nazi Azov battalion at Stanford University, whom he declared to be heroes. The second was developed by the British Stalinist and historian Eric Hobsbawm, who claimed that there had been a short 20th century, because in his view, the end of the USSR marked the death of the Russian Revolution, and thereby the end of the century. The third conception was that developed by the International Committee, the unfinished 20th century. In essence, this conception maintains that all the fundamental historical contradictions of the world capitalist system that gave rise to two world wars, fascism, but also the October Revolution, remain unresolved. At stake in this conception of the unfinished 20th century was, first, the Marxist understanding of our epoch as the epoch of imperialist wars and world socialist revolution, and second, the role and continuity of the Marxist leadership in that revolution. In response to an essay by Hobsbawm that rejected any consideration of the struggle of the left opposition against Stalinism as quote-unquote speculative, David North explained that in the socialist revolution, the role of the subjective factor, that is of parties, programs, and the very process of political struggle, cannot be subtracted from the so-called objective historical process. In fact, Hobsbawm's own essay demonstrated that ignoring or downplaying the subjective factor can only result in a distortion of the historical record. By dismissing the struggle of the left opposition as a quote-unquote counterfactual, he offered essentially an apology for Stalinism. In dealing with Hobsbawm's conceptions on a more fundamental theoretical level, North stressed that the October Revolution was not, as Hobsbawm claimed, akin to a natural disaster like an earthquake or a flood, which might be predicted by scientists but cannot qualitatively be influenced by the actions of human beings. The socialist revolution developed in a manner that was qualitatively different from that of the bourgeois revolutions. David North explained, with the advent of Marxism, the relation of man to his own history underwent a profound transformation. Man acquired the capacity to consciously interpret his thought and actions in socioeconomic terms, and thereby to precisely locate his own activity within the chain of historical causality. The analyses, perspectives, strategies, and programs of political organizations assumed an altogether unprecedented role in the historical process. History ceased to simply happen. It was anticipated, prepared for, and to an extent hitherto impossible, consciously directed. End quote. The alignment of the social thought and practice of the revolutionary class with objective reality reached its so far unsurpassed culmination in the October seizure of power by the working class in Russia in 1917. The Trotskyist movement historically emerged amidst an ebb of the revolutionary wave that had forced the end of World War I and had given rise to the 1917 revolution. In a sense, this was one of the most tragic, if not the most tragic period in history. The 30 years that passed between the October Revolution and the end of World War II saw the defeats of immense revolutionary struggles across Asia and Europe, the advent of fascism in Germany and other countries in Europe, the Second World War with its 60 million dead, the Holocaust, and the annihilation of generations of Marxists and Socialists by Stalinism. But it was not only a period of tragic defeats, reaction, and capitalist barbarism. It was also one of a determined and heroic struggle for the preservation and development of the continuity of Marxism and the forging of an international revolutionary cadre that could lead the working class in struggle. Trotsky summed up the most critical lesson of that period in the first sentence of the founding document of the Fourth International. The world political situation as a whole is chiefly characterized by a historical crisis of the leadership of the proletariat. Our lecture will be dedicated to a summation of the strategic experiences of the international working class that underlay this assessment and remain foundational to the struggle for socialism today. Eric Hobsbawm's claims that the October Revolution was quote-unquote dead by 1991 and that Stalinism was inevitable rested on two interrelated arguments. First, that the revolution was a largely uncontrollable, automatic process, and second, that it was above all a national event and bound to remain isolated. Hobsbawm dismissed the notion out of hand that a revolution in Germany in particular was in the cards. He wrote, "A German October Revolution was not seriously on and therefore didn't have to be betrayed." End quote. These claims are false. The October Revolution did not fall from the sky. It had objective and subjective preconditions, and both of these were, fundamentally, of an international character. In terms of its socioeconomic basis, the October Revolution arose out of the same contradictions of the world empire system that had given rise to the First World War. However, while these objective contradictions explain the emergence of revolutionary struggles in Russia, they do not explain the successful seizure of power by the working class. As the International Committee stressed in the wake of 1991, the level of political consciousness attained by the working class in 1917 was the product of a conscious, protracted historical struggle for Marxism in the European and Russian working class that had spanned the previous 70 years. This struggle reached its theoretical and political high point in the work of Lenin and Trotsky, the two principal leaders of the revolution. It included two key elements. First, the struggle waged by Lenin's Bolsheviks for an independent revolutionary party of the working class in a fight against national opportunism. Second, Trotsky's development of the conception of permanent revolution. Based on a historical evaluation of the entire preceding development of the social revolution and the world economy, Trotsky recognized that in our epoch, even in an economically backward country like Russia, the working class was the only revolutionary class capable of leading the revolution and completing the tasks of the bourgeois democratic revolution. As early as 1906, he wrote, "Binding all countries together with its mode of production and its commerce, capitalism has converted the whole world into a single economic and political organism. This immediately gives the events now unfolding," he was speaking of the Russian Revolution of 1905, "an international character and opens up a wide horizon. The political emancipation of Russia, led by the working class, will raise that class to a height as yet unknown in history, will transfer to it colossal power and resources, and make it the initiator of the liquidation of world capitalism, for which history has created all the objective conditions." End quote. However, the contradictions between the dictatorship of the working class and what was still a predominantly peasant country could only be resolved through an extension of the revolution on a world scale. The fate of the revolution in Russia was going to be decided ultimately and primarily on the world arena. This strategic conception of the dynamics of the socialist revolution was the basis for the October seizure of power in 1917 and the establishment of the Soviet Union in December 1922. Contrary to the Bolsheviks' expectations, however, the working class in Europe failed to seize power, above all as a result of the betrayals of social democracy. Several revolutionary movements, indicated here with red flags, were betrayed, and most notably in Germany in 1918-1919, as well as in Hungary and Italy in 1919. The economically devastated Soviet Republic, unexpectedly, after several years of civil war, found itself isolated in capitalist encirclement. The Soviet government was forced to initiate a significant retreat with the so-called New Economic Policy. This policy, though necessary under the given conditions, contributed to a strengthening of bourgeois forces within Soviet society. To make matters more difficult, Lenin, the most authoritative leader of the party, became seriously ill and bedridden in 1922. Although he managed to initiate a struggle against the growing bureaucratic and national tendencies within the party, he would prematurely die in January 1924. A long nation struggle in the party leadership between an increasingly emboldened national opportunist wing and the Marxist left wing, led by Lenin and Trotsky, burst into the open in the context of the aborted German Revolution of October 1923. Trotsky and the internationalist revolutionary wing of the party now initiated an open struggle aimed at reorienting the policies of the party. On October 15, 1923, 46 old Bolsheviks issued a joint declaration stating their political support for Trotsky's insistence on the need for inter-party democracy and his calls for greater emphasis on planning and the strengthening of state industry. This is this shows some of the signatures on that document. The approach Trotsky took to the struggle of the left opposition can only be understood based on the conception that he and Lenin had developed of the role of the Marxist leadership in the socialist revolution. In his essay, Leon Trotsky and the Development of Marxism from 1982, which was referenced in the earlier session, David North explained that the experiences of the collapse of the Second International in 1914 and the seizure of power in 1917 invested, quote, the concept of cadre training and of the role of the International with a new historical content. The Communist International proceeded from the fundamental premise that the socialist revolution could not be left to the inexorable working out of abstractly conceived, objective economic forces and social contradictions. The leaders of the revolutionary parties of the Comintern had to recognize that their subjective practice was a decisive objective link in the chain of historical events leading to the overthrow of capitalism. End quote. This basic conception was confirmed, in the negative, by the defeat suffered by the working class between 1917 and 23. The principal reason for those defeats was the absence of a revolutionary leadership comparable to that of the Bolsheviks in 1917. In 1924, Trotsky concluded, quote, it cannot be thought that history mechanically creates the conditions for revolution and presents them thereafter at the party's request, at any moment on a plate. Here you are, sign the receipt, please. That does not happen. A class must, in the course of a prolonged struggle, forge a vanguard, which will be able to find its way in a situation, which will recognize revolution when it knocks at the door, which at the necessary moment will be able to grasp the problem of insurrection as a problem of art, to work out a plan, distribute roles, and deal a merciless blow at the bourgeoisie. End quote. In Lessons of October, Trotsky developed this analysis further, based on a review of the political struggle within the Bolshevik Party during the 1917 revolution. At the time, Grigory Zinoviev, Lev Kamenev, and Joseph Stalin led a faction that opposed the seizure of power, arguing that conditions in Russia were not mature enough for socialist revolution. Trotsky emphasized that under conditions of sharp shifts in the political situation, pressures to adapt to bourgeois public opinion and national tendencies were inevitable. A revolutionary party is subject to the pressure of hostile class forces. The challenge of a party leadership is to fight such pressures and to ensure that the party keeps step with the historical tasks of its class. Otherwise, Trotsky warned, the party, quote, runs the risk of becoming the indirect tool of other classes, end quote. The party leadership, which was now dominated by Stalin, Zinoviev, and Kamenev, responded to the publication of Lessons of October 1924 with an embittered campaign against Trotsky and against permanent revolution. In the course of this campaign, the entire history of the Bolshevik Party and the 1917 revolution was subject to systematic falsification. In December 1924, Stalin elaborated the conception that it was possible to build socialism in one country, in Russia, without the seizure of power by the working class in Europe. This anti-Marxist and nationalist theory would form the political basis for the Stalinist reaction against the October Revolution. When posed the question of why he lost political power in 1923-24, Trotsky always rejected subjective explanations that reduced matters to a struggle for power and the clash of different personalities. Underlying the shift in the political orientation of the Bolshevik leadership and the degeneration of the party were profound shifts in the international balance of class forces, which had an immense impact on political and social relations in the Soviet Union. The delay of the international revolution fostered moods of disillusionment in the numerically and economically weakened Soviet working class. At the same time, these defeats and the resulting international isolation consolidated the position of a rapidly growing bureaucracy whose social interests were increasingly articulated by nationally oriented forces in the party leadership. Trotsky later explained the political and socio-psychological processes underway as follows. Quote, the sentiment of not all and always for the revolution, but something for oneself as well, was translated as down with permanent revolution. The revolt against the exacting theoretical demands of Marxism and the exacting political demands of the revolution gradually assumed, in the eyes of these people, the form of a struggle against Trotskyism. Under this banner, the liberation of the Philistine and the Bolshevik was proceeding. It was because of this that I lost power, and it was this that determined the form which this loss took. End quote. The rise of the Soviet bureaucracy also underlay a profound shift in the orientation of the Communist International, in which the Soviet Party played the dominant role. In December 1925, the Bolshevik Party officially adopted the nationalist program of building socialism in one country. This orientation was explicitly supplemented by the conception that a, quote, period of peaceful coexistence, end quote, between the Soviet Union and the capitalist countries had begun. From the standpoint of the bureaucracy, the main function of the Comintern increasingly became not the fight to lead the working class in the overthrow of the bourgeoisie. Rather, the task was, as Stalin put it, to quote-unquote neutralize the bourgeoisie and prevent possible military attacks on the USSR. This national orientation led to catastrophic defeats of the working class. The first major betrayal of Stalinism was the defeat of the British general strike in May 1926. The Stalinist leadership subordinated a powerful movement by the working class in one of the most important imperialist countries to union bureaucrats and labor reformists. The second major betrayal was that of the Chinese Revolution of 1925-27. If the seizure of power of the working class in 1917 was the positive confirmation of permanent revolution and the struggle for an independent revolutionary party of the working class, the Chinese Revolution was a tragic confirmation of them in the negative. In 1925-26, China saw the emergence of a gigantic revolutionary movement by workers and peasants. Yet, instead of preparing the Chinese working class and its leadership for the seizure of state power with the support of the poor masses of peasants, the Stalinized Comintern adopted the line in which the Chinese Communist Party had to subordinate its entire activities to the interests of the Kuomintang, the party of the national bourgeoisie. The Communist Party in China was not even allowed to criticize the Kuomintang or run an independent press. This class collaborationist policy was based on a revival of the old Menshevik conception of a revolution in two stages. Based on this conception, the working class in economically backward countries has to first help bring the bourgeoisie to power. Only after a prolonged period of capitalist development could the working class then aspire to seize power itself. In regard to China, Stalin argued that imperialist oppression would form the basis for a bloc of four classes: an alliance between the working class, the peasantry, the urban petty bourgeoisie, and the national bourgeoisie. But as Trotsky explained, it is a gross mistake to think that imperialism mechanically welds together all the classes of China from without. The class struggle between the bourgeoisie and the masses of workers and peasants is not weakened, but on the contrary is sharpened by imperialist oppression to the point of bloody civil war at every serious conflict. The politics of the Comintern had catastrophic consequences. In April 1927, Kuomintang leader Chiang Kai-shek staged a coup in Shanghai and slaughtered tens of thousands of Chinese workers and communists. The renewed setback for the international revolution had a profound impact on the Soviet working class, encouraging moves of conservatism and demoralization by reinforcing the social and political position of the bureaucracy. At the 15th Congress of the Communist Party in December 1927, the left opposition was expelled from the party. In the weeks that followed, Trotsky and virtually all other leaders of the opposition were exiled. Throughout 1928, thousands of oppositionists were expelled, arrested, and either exiled or imprisoned. Trotsky's principal response to these events was a systematic review of the strategic experiences that the working class had just gone through. The resultant document, his critique of the draft program of the Comintern, remains foundational not only to our historical perspective, but to the very approach that we take to the political analysis and development of the ICFI and the World Socialist website. Central to Trotsky's refutation of the nationalist revision of Marxism by Stalinism was his insistence on the strategic definition of our epoch as the epoch of imperialist war and socialist revolution. In this epoch, which was characterized by the dominance of the world economy and finance capital, as well as by sharp shifts in the objective situation, the role of revolutionary leadership assumed exceptional significance. Therefore, the question of a correct strategic and programmatic orientation of that leadership was decisive. Trotsky summarized the basic internationalist principles that had to underlie the political orientation of the International as follows. Quote, "The international program must proceed directly from an analysis of the conditions and tendencies of world economy and of the world political system taken as a whole. In the present epoch, to a much larger extent than in the past, the national orientation of the proletariat must and can flow only from a world orientation and not vice versa. Herein lies the basic and primary difference between communist internationalism and all varieties of National Socialism." End quote. By accident, James Buchanan, who attended the 6th Congress of the Comintern in Moscow in the summer of 1928, as a delegate of the American Communist Party, gained access to a copy of this document. He studied it and smuggled it out of the USSR. This marked the emergence of the American Trotskyist movement and the beginning of systematic international work of the opposition. Despite the betrayals of Stalinism and the increasingly violent crackdown on the left opposition, Trotsky throughout this period insisted that the opposition had to orient toward a reform of the Soviet Party and the International. This course was only changed in response to one of the greatest political catastrophes of the 20th century, the coming to power of Hitler in Germany.
The fatal role played by the KPD, the German Communist Party, and the entire Comintern in the German catastrophe made it necessary to start building a new Fourth International. This reorientation was not a subjective reaction to the dramatic events, but was based on an objective analysis of the historical development and the role of Stalinism. It was the KPD's refusal to fight for a united front policy that would unite the working class under the leadership of the KPD in the struggle for power that led to the German catastrophe. Of course, Hobsbawm would denounce this as speculation, but there's no question that Hitler could have been stopped. With many million socialists and communist workers, Germany had the largest organized workers' movement in the world, which had proved its willingness to fight more than once and had a rich Marxist history. Workers were prepared to oppose Hitler. In the last reasonably free elections in November 1932, the two major working class parties, the Social Democrats, SPD, and the Communist Party, together won 37.3%, far more votes than Hitler's NSDAP, with 33.1%. And the official elections were only a weak reflection of the real balance of power. But instead of unifying the working class on the basis of a revolutionary perspective against fascism, the KPD adopted an ultra-leftist line, equating social democracy with fascism, thus dividing and confusing the working class, and handing over large sections of the petty bourgeoisie to Hitler's fascist demagogy. In the process, the KPD not only rejected any collaboration with the SPD against the fascist danger, in some cases, it even made common cause with the Nazis, perhaps most infamously when it backed the Red Referendum initiated by the NSDAP in 1931 to oust the SPD-led government in the German state of Prussia. Explaining the political goals and significance of the policy of the United Front, Trotsky wrote in May 1933, quote, "No policy of the Communist Party could, of course, have transformed the social democracy into a party of the revolution. But neither was that the aim. It was necessary to exploit to the limit the contradiction between reformism and fascism in order to weaken fascism, at the same time weakening reformism by exposing to the workers the incapacity of the social democratic leadership. These two tasks fused naturally into one. The policy of the Comintern bureaucracy led to the opposite result. The capitulation of the reformists served the interests of fascism and not of communism. The social democratic workers remained with their leaders. The communist workers lost faith in themselves and in the leadership." End of quote. The necessary political conclusions had to be drawn. From now on, the perspective of seeking a reform of the communist parties and the Communist International had no validity. As David North notes in Leon Trotsky and the Development of Marxism, the quote, "quantitative accumulation of political betrayals had produced a qualitative transformation of Stalinism itself, It had passed from bureaucratic centrism to conscious counter-revolution, end of quote. Trotsky wrote about the, quote, change of orientation, end of quote, in his important programmatic article, To Build Communist Parties and an International Anew. Quote, the most dangerous thing in politics is to fall captive to one's own formula that yesterday was appropriate, but is bereft of all content today. An organization which was not roused by the thunder of fascism and which submits docilely to such outrageous acts of the bureaucracy demonstrates thereby that it is dead and that nothing can ever revive it. To say this openly and publicly is our direct duty toward the proletariat and its future. In all our subsequent work, it is necessary to take as our point of departure the historical collapse of the official Communist International. End of quote. At the center of Trotsky's work was the clarification of the political and historical situation and the tasks arising from it. Only on this basis could the development of the left opposition as the new political leadership of the working class be advanced. The development of a cadre is, quote, not merely an organizational problem, it is a political problem. Cadre are formed on the basis of a definite perspective, end of quote. Trotsky explained in KBD or New Party. Quote, to again warm up the slogan of party reform means to knowingly set a utopian aim and thereby to push our own cadre toward new and ever sharper disappointments. With such a course, the left opposition would only become the appendage of a decomposing party and would disappear from the scene together with it. End of quote. While the Stalinist bureaucracy in the Soviet Union and the Stalinized Comintern were now ever more openly acting as opponents of the revolution, Trotsky's policy was oriented toward the development of the international class struggle and world socialist revolution. Trotsky was concerned with working out a correct political line to raise the consciousness of the working class and bring it into line with the requirements of the historical situation. The whole historical experience shows that fascism can be fought only through the independent mobilization of the working class against capitalism. Fascism is not simply a wrong or bad policy, but the response of the ruling class to the crisis of the capitalist system. As Trotsky wrote in January 1932 in What Next? Quote, at the moment that the normal police and military resources of the bourgeois dictatorship, together with their parliamentary screens, no longer suffice to hold society in a state of equilibrium, the turn of the fascist regime arrives. End of quote. In Germany, on March 24, 1933, all bourgeois parties, without exception, voted for Hitler's Enabling Act, thus laying the legal foundations for the establishment of the Nazi dictatorship. In doing so, the German capitalist class pursued two interrelated goals. First, the crushing of the workers' movement, and second, the preparation for another imperialist war after the catastrophe of the First World War. Trotsky elaborated on this in What is National Socialism? Quote, the compulsory concentration of all forces and resources of the people in the interests of imperialism, the true historic mission of the fascist dictatorship, means preparation for war. And this task, in its turn, brooks no internal resistance and leads to a further mechanical concentration of power. Fascism cannot be reformed or retired from service. It can only be overthrown. The political orbit of the regime leans up the alternative, war or revolution. End of quote. In response to the victory of the Nazis in Germany, opposition to capitalism and fascism grew enormously in the working class across Europe. But the revolutionary offensives of the working class in France and Spain also ended in defeat. The reason for these defeats was the Comintern's policy of the Popular Front, i.e. an alliance of the Stalinized communist parties not only with social democratic parties and trade unions, but also with the leading capitalist parties. Ideologically, this alliance was justified by the Stalinists with the argument that it was about defending democracy against fascism. But essentially, it amounted to the defense of capitalist interests against the revolutionary aspirations of the workers. Trotsky fought against the position that in the struggle against fascism, the working class must support the supposedly democratic wing of the bourgeoisie, or as today's pseudo-leftists would say, the lesser evil. He did so from the standpoint of clarifying the central political questions and tasks confronting the working class. Trotsky wrote in Lessons of Spain, The Last Warning, quote, "Fascism is not feudal but bourgeois reaction. A successful fight against bourgeois reaction can be waged only with the forces and methods of the proletariat revolution. Menshevism, itself a branch of bourgeois thought, does not have and cannot have any inkling of these facts." The Bolshevik point of view, clearly expressed only by the young section of the Fourth International, takes the theory of permanent revolution as its starting point. Namely, that even purely democratic problems, like the liquidation of semi-feudal land ownership, cannot be solved without the conquest of power by the proletariat. But this in turn places the socialist revolution on the agenda. End of quote. Trotsky developed the necessary revolutionary perspective and leadership for the working class in a constant polemic against centrist political tendencies, which sought to find a middle way between the Stalinist parties and the Trotskyist movement, i.e. between reformist and revolutionary politics. In his article, Centrism and the Fourth International, Trotsky explained the most important features of centrism as a political tendency. Quote, "Theoretically, centrism is amorphous and eclectic. So far as possible, it evades theoretical obligations and inclines, in words, to give preference to revolutionary practice over theory, without understanding that only Marxian theory can impart revolutionary direction to practice. A centrist views with hatred the revolutionary principle, state that which is, and inclines to substitute for a principled policy personal maneuvering and petty organizational diplomacy. His shilly-shallying the centrist frequently covers up by reference to the danger of sectarianism, by which he understands not abstract propagandist passivity, but an active concern for purity of principles, clarity of position, political consistency, organizational completeness. And he does not understand that in the present epoch, a national revolutionary party can be built only as part of an international party." End of quote. The socialists and Stalinists could not have strangled the revolutionary offensive of the Spanish working class without the help of the anarcho-syndicalists and the centrist POUM. They formed the left wing of the Popular Front and joined the government at the crucial moment, preparing the way for counter-revolution. In 1937, Trotsky concluded in his article, The Lessons of Spain, The Last Warning, quote, "Contrary to its own intentions, the POUM proved to be, in the final analysis, the chief obstacle on the road to the creation of a revolutionary party." End of quote. He summed up the lessons of the POUM's role as follows. Quote, "It is necessary to think out the problem of the revolution to the end, to its ultimate concrete conclusions. It is necessary to adjust policy to the basic laws of the revolution, i.e. to the movement of the embattled classes and not the prejudices or fears of the superficial petty bourgeois groups who call themselves popular fronts and every other kind of front. During revolution, the line of least resistance is the line of greatest disaster. To fear isolation from the bourgeoisie is to incur isolation from the masses. Adaptation to the conservative prejudices to the labor aristocracy is betrayal of the workers and the revolution. In excess caution is the most painful lack of caution. This is the chief lesson of the destruction of the most honest political organization in Spain, namely the centrist POUM. The parties and groups of the London Bureau obviously either do not wish to draw the necessary conclusions from the last warning of history or are unable to do so. By this token, they doom themselves. End of quote. The lessons from the experience with Popular Front politics in France were also central to the development of the Fourth International. Writings such as Wither France are essential foundations of our movement. They illuminate, above all, the crucial importance of the subjective factor in objectively developing revolutionary situation. Trotsky polemicized sharply against the attitude of the Stalinists, who replaced, quote, the theory of revolutionary action with the religion of fatalism, end of quote, and justified their orientation toward the bourgeoisie by claiming that the situation was not revolutionary. Trotsky wrote, quote, the diagnosis of the Comintern is entirely false. The situation is revolutionary as it can be, granted the non-revolutionary policies of the working class parties. More exactly, the situation is pre-revolutionary. In order to bring the situation to its full maturity, there must be an immediate, vigorous, unremitting mobilization of the masses, under the slogan of the conquest of power in the name of socialism. This is the only way through which the pre-revolutionary situation will be changed into a revolutionary situation. On the other hand, if you continue to mark time, the pre-revolutionary situation will inevitably be changed into one of counter-revolution and will bring on the victory of fascism. End of quote. Trotsky stressed the crucial role of political preparation in the development of the revolution, explaining what it consists of. Quote, it is in the revolutionary cohesion of the masses, in the liberation from servile hopes, in the clemency, generosity, and loyalty of democratic slave owners, in the education of revolutionary cadre, who know how to defy official public opinion and who know how to display toward the bourgeoisie 1/10 of the implacability which the bourgeoisie displays toward the toilers. End of quote. To the Stalinists' claim that the final crisis of the capitalist system has not yet begun, Trotsky replied, quote, the revolutionary worker must, before all else, understand that Marxism, the only scientific theory of the proletarian revolution, has nothing in common with the fatalistic hope for the final crisis. Marxism is, in its very essence, a set of directives for revolutionary action. Marxism does not overlook will and courage, but rather aids them to find the right road. End of quote. And he continued, there is no crisis which can be by itself fatal to capitalism. The oscillations of the business cycle only create a situation in which it will be easier or more difficult for the proletariat to overthrow capitalism. The transformation from a bourgeois society to a socialist society presupposes the activity of living men who are the makers of their own history. They do not make history by accident or according to their caprice, but under the influence of objectively determined causes. However, their own actions, their initiative, audacity, devotion, and likewise their stupidity and cowardice are necessary links in the chain of historical development. End of quote. These questions are of burning actuality today. Under conditions in which revolutionary struggles of the working class are beginning to emerge, today's pseudo-left organizations once again insist that the situation is not revolutionary and that the workers therefore do not need a revolutionary socialist perspective and leadership, but must rather confine their actions to the existing framework of bourgeois capitalist politics. Unlike the Social Democratic and Stalinist parties in the 1930s, they do not have a mass base in the working class and cannot be called workers' organizations in any sense. However, the essential class content and political orientation of these popular front politics is the same. While the ruling class as a whole is increasingly turning to fascism and dictatorship, pseudo-left organizations declare that the working class must support the allegedly more democratic representatives of the bourgeoisie. They are thus themselves part of the right-wing counter-revolutionary conspiracy against the working class. Only the ICFI is basing its policies on the lessons of the 1930s. Today, as then, the struggle against fascism and war requires the independent political mobilization of the working class, which must be united internationally on the basis of its common class interests, against capitalism and its political defenders and for socialism. The question of political leadership is decisive and can only be resolved on a clear political reckoning with the counter-revolutionary experiences of the 1930s, and especially the nature of Stalinism.
While the bureaucracy was strangling revolutionary struggles of the working class in Europe, it embarked on a campaign of mass murder of revolutionaries within and outside the borders of the USSR. On August 19th, 1936, the first of 3 show trials began in Moscow. In these trials, the most prominent leaders of the October Revolution, many of whom had previously been oppositionists, were accused of quote-unquote counter-revolutionary activities. Forced to give false confessions, they were dragged through the mud in public before being executed. The main defendants were Leon Trotsky and his son and close collaborator, Lev Sedov. Trotsky responded to the trials by initiating the Independent Dewey Commission. And we will now play a brief clip from a speech that Trotsky gave in January 1937, in which he introduced that commission.
There are no crime in history more terrible in intention and execution than the Moscow trials of Zinoviev-Kamenev and of Petakov-Radek. These trials developed not from communism, not from socialism, but from Stalinism, that is, from the irresponsible despotism of the bureaucracy over the people. What is now my principal task? To reveal the truth, to show and to demonstrate that the true criminals hide under the cloak of the accusers. What will be the next step in this direction? The creation of an American and European and subsequently also an international commission of inquiry, composed of people who incontestably enjoy authority and public consideration. In confidence, I undertake to present to such a commission all my files, thousands of personal and open letters, in which the developments of my thought and my action is reflected day by day without any gaps. I have nothing to hide. Dozens of witnesses who are abroad possess invaluable facts and documents which will shed light on the Moscow frame-ups. The work of the Commission of Inquiry must terminate in a great counter-trial. A counter-trial is necessary to cleanse the atmosphere of the germs of deceit, calumny, falsification, and frame-ups whose source is Stalin's police, the GPU, which has fallen to the level of the Nazi Gestapo. Esteemed audience, you may have many varying attitudes toward my ideas and my political activity for 40 years, but an impartial inquiry will confirm that there is not a stain on my honor, both personal and political. Profoundly convinced that the right is on my side, I wholeheartedly salute the citizens of the New World.
The Dewey Commission found Trotsky and all the other defendants of the trials to be not guilty. When we speak of the terror, we use the term political genocide. This is not simply an attempt to express moral outrage. The term has a very specific political and historical content. What occurred in the second half of the 1930s and through the early 1940s was a systematic, targeted attempt to physically destroy the bearers of the Marxist and socialist culture, which had formed the basis of the development of the international workers' movement for an entire historical period. As Trotsky explained, with this act of mass murder, quote, the ruling stratum is ejecting from its midst all those who reminded of its revolutionary past, the principles of socialism, liberty, equality, fraternity, and the unsolved tasks of the world revolution. The bestiality of the repressions testifies to the hatred which the privileged caste bears to the revolutionists. End quote. The campaign of mass murder of Soviet revolutionaries was complemented with the physical annihilation of large portions of the Communist International. This includes most of the membership of the Polish Communist Party, and internationally, it was complemented by assassinations of revolutionaries, especially in Spain. It would be incorrect to state that the terror, which resulted in the murder of at least 1 million people within the borders of the Soviet Union, and the arrest and imprisonment of many, many more, only affected socialists and Trotskyists. But it is a documented historical fact that committed revolutionary workers and intellectuals, and above all Trotskyists, were its principal target. The thousands of revolutionaries who had signed documents of the opposition in the 1920s were now systematically tracked down, arrested, and executed. Among them were hundreds, if not thousands, of Trotskyists whose names and works have largely remained unknown to this day, but who never capitulated to Stalinism and continued the struggle for socialism until the very days of their execution. On this slide, you see images of what are called shooting lists. There are 390 known such shooting lists. They were signed by Stalin and other members of the Politburo, and they covered a total of at least 46,255 individuals. On the left, you can see the cover of one such list, which was signed by Stalin, Kaganovich, Voroshilov, and Zhdanov, I think. In the middle, you can see a list of names. I won't go through it, but the first one is Mikhail Boguslavsky, who was a leading Bolshevik and oppositionist. And then the third image gives you a sense of the scale of just this one aspect of the terror, and there were others. This is a list of shooting lists, which were compiled between September 7th, 1937, and March 8th, 1938. The first number on the left shows the total number of individuals who were listed. The second number shows those who were ordered to be shot by members of the Politburo. And the third, much smaller number, indicates those who were only ordered to be imprisoned. For instance, in one line, you can see the figures for one day, just one day, on January 3rd, 1938, when 2,771 people in total were sentenced in this manner. Of these, 2,548 were ordered to be shot, and 233 were ordered to be imprisoned. Next slide, please. Here you can see on the left-hand side a portion of a list that was compiled based on documents by the opposition. These are only people who signed opposition documents. There were many different such lists. This particular one included or was grouped around the place of employment of these oppositionists. And I want to highlight one figure who's basically unknown, but was an extraordinary figure in the history of the workers' movement, Boris Eltsine. He's number 17 on this list. The list includes information as to when they joined the party. He joined in 1897. That is 1 year before the Russian Social Democratic Party was even founded. and he was the general secretary of the Soviet opposition in the late 1920s. He was a participant of all three Russian revolutions. He joined the fight of the opposition. All of his three children were oppositionists. One of his sons was a secretary of Trotsky. And all of them were persecuted in the terror. Boris Eltsine himself was arrested, as were everyone on these lists, as was everyone on these lists. He was shot after leading a hunger strike in a camp in November 1937. At that point, he was already in his early 60s. His son, who was also leading oppositionist, was murdered just 4 months after that, also after having led a hunger strike. I want to stress that this manner of protest, these hunger strikes, were not a sign of despair. They were, in the face of almost certain death, the only way for these Trotskyists to demonstrate their unwavering devotion to the cause of the working class in opposition to Stalinism. And it was, in fact, the most common manner for unyielding Trotskyists to be executed at the time. And then the last image on the next slide I wanted to show depicts perhaps the most famous or infamous shooting site of the terror, Kommunarka. It's a place just outside of Moscow where a very large portion of the early Soviet governments and the Bolshevik Party were executed. There are many such shooting sites, many of which have not even been identified in Russia, in Ukraine, throughout the former Soviet Union. At this particular shooting site, excavation works were only completed in 2021, so just before the war began. Now, this mass murder of Trotskyists, which occurred within the USSR, was fundamentally international in scope. Several of the most important leaders of the Trotskyist movement in Europe, among them Erwin Wolf, Rudolf Clement, and Trotsky's son Lev Sedov, were murdered. This campaign of mass murder culminated with the political crime of the century, the August 1940 assassination of Leon Trotsky in Mexico by a Stalinist agent. The after effects of this political genocide were felt throughout the 20th century, and indeed are felt to this day. In 1937, at the height of the terror, Trotsky summarized the devastating impact of Stalinism on the consciousness of the working class. He wrote, "No one, not excluding Hitler, has dealt socialism such deadly blows as Stalin." But he also predicted, "History will not pardon a single drop of blood shed in sacrifice to the new Moloch of self-will and privilege. Revolution will unlock all the secret compartments, review all the trials, rehabilitate the slandered, raise memorials to the victims of wantonness, and cover with eternal infamy the names of the executioners. Stalin will depart from the scene, laden with all the crimes which he has committed, not only as the gravedigger of the revolution, but as the most sinister figure in the history of mankind." End quote. The brutality and historical magnitude of the crimes of Stalinism notwithstanding, Trotsky never took a subjective approach to the role of Stalin as an individual or the Soviet bureaucracy more broadly. The monstrous role of Stalin could in fact only be understood based on the social forces whose interests he represented. Just 2 weeks before the beginning of the first Moscow trial, Trotsky had finished the manuscript of his Revolution Betrayed. This work proved to be foundational to the historical and programmatic orientation of the Fourth International. In contrast to impressionistic responses to the rise of Stalinism by demoralized middle-class radicals, Trotsky subjected the bureaucratic degeneration of the Soviet Union to a scientific, historical materialist analysis. The conditions of international isolation and economic backwardness confronting the worker state after 1917 had given rise to a bureaucracy which had usurped political power from the proletariat and enjoyed vast social privileges. Sociologically speaking, the position of this bureaucracy was that of a privileged caste, not that of a social class. In contrast to the socioeconomic position of the bourgeoisie, the privileges of the bureaucracy were not rooted in the ownership of the means of production. Rather, they were based on the bureaucracy's political usurpation of power from the working class in the state, which, as a result of the October Revolution, was in control of the means of production. Rejecting the simplistic and ahistorical use of categories like socialism and capitalism, Trotsky explained that the Soviet Union was a transitional society. Its fate had not yet been determined by history. He wrote, "The October Revolution has been betrayed by the ruling strata, but not yet overthrown. It has a great power of resistance, coinciding with the established property relations, with the living force of the proletariat, the consciousness of its best elements, the impasse of world capitalism, and the inevitability of world revolution." End quote. Thus, the Soviet Union remained a worker state, albeit one that was undergoing a serious bureaucratic degeneration. Within that worker state, and the workers' movement more broadly, the Stalinist bureaucracy functioned as a counter-revolutionary agency of imperialism. Under these conditions, the only way for the working class to defend the conquests of the October Revolution was to overthrow the bureaucracy in a political revolution as part of a fight to extend the revolution internationally. But Trotsky also warned that absent such a political revolution, a backslide to capitalism is wholly possible. Indeed, half a century before the Soviet bureaucracy would move to restore capitalism in 1985, Trotsky recognized that the transformation of the bureaucracy into a new property-owning class and its destruction of the Soviet state was one of the possible paths of development. However, capitalist restoration was not a foregone conclusion. Trotsky wrote, "In the last analysis, the question will be decided by a struggle of living social forces, both on the national and the world arena." End quote. The scientifically grounded position has historically distinguished the International Committee from all petty bourgeois tendencies claiming to be socialist or even Trotskyist. Both the tabloids and the state capitalists, if in different ways, ascribed to the Soviet bureaucracy a role that it did not possess. The state capitalists proclaimed that the bureaucracy was a new ruling class. The tabloids, for their part, would ascribe to the bureaucracy a revolutionary role, claiming that it could be pressured to realize socialism in the USSR and internationally by means of self-reform. Despite arriving at seemingly opposite conclusions, both of these positions were ultimately rooted in the social interests of petty bourgeois layers who rejected the perspective of the 1917 revolution and wrote off the working class as a revolutionary force. They were also bound up with the downplaying and outright denial of the counter-revolutionary role of Stalinism and a cover-up of its worst crimes. The role of Pabloism as a historical accomplice of Stalinism and imperialism was demonstrated irrefutably in the tabloids' violent opposition to the investigation carried out by the International Committee into the assassination of Leon Trotsky. And leaders of the present-day adherents of state capitalism in the United States, the Democratic Socialists of America, openly celebrate the Stalinist assassination of Trotsky. Throughout the entire history of the Fourth International, the struggle against national opportunism and revisionism has centrally involved an exposure of the crimes of Stalinism and a defense of Trotsky's scientific analysis of the Stalinist betrayal of October. On the basis of this analysis, the IC was able to anticipate and develop a struggle against the restoration of capitalism by the Stalinist bureaucracy in 1985-1991. In contrast to a myriad of petty bourgeois ex-left forces, the response of the Trotskyist movement to the eventual collapse of Stalinism and destruction of the worker state was not a renunciation of the perspective of socialism. On the contrary, the IC responded to 1991 by developing, in collaboration with the Soviet historian Vadim Rogovin, a concerted campaign to uncover and defend the historical truth about the struggle of the left opposition against Stalinism and the entire history of the Trotskyist movement. The initiation of this campaign was a strategic decision. We recognized that the fight for historical truth would have to be the foundation for the revival of Marxist consciousness and a socialist culture in the working class and the training of new generations of revolutionaries. This is just a very small selection of titles that were produced as part of that fight. There are multiple volumes, hundreds, if not thousands of articles on these questions on the World Socialist website. And this campaign today has really morphed into a fight against both the racialist and the fascist falsification of all of history. The work that has been and is still being conducted by the ICFI in this regard underscores above all the extraordinary prescience and historical import of Trotsky's fight for the Fourth International. As David North noted in his 1987 speech, Trotskyism versus Stalinism, in founding the Fourth International, amidst the campaign of mass murder by Stalinism, Trotsky, quote, succeeded in ensuring the historical continuity of Marxism, of bequeathing to future generations of the working class a world party which embodied the great theoretical heritage and vast practical experience of the international workers' movement, end quote.
In Leon Trotsky and the Development of Marxism, David North states that the founding of the Fourth International in September 1938, quote, represented the culmination of Leon Trotsky's life as a Marxist and proletarian revolutionist, end of quote. This was also Trotsky's own assessment. On March 25, 1935, he noted in his diary, quote, the collapse of the two internationals has posed a problem which none of the leaders of these internationals is at all equipped to solve. The vicissitudes of my personal fate have confronted me with this problem and armed me with important experience in dealing with it. There's now no one except me to carry out the mission of arming a new generation with the revolutionary method over the heads of the leaders of the Second and Third International, end of quote. Perhaps the most critical element of the revolutionary method is that Marxism must be brought to the working class, and that revolutionary leadership is not the product of an unconscious, spontaneous process. The first sentence, which we quoted before, of the program adopted at the founding conference of the Fourth International in Paris in 1938, entitled The Death Agony of Capitalism and the Tasks of the Fourth International, sums up this question in all its meaning and depth. Quote, the world political situation as a whole is chiefly characterized by a historical crisis of the leadership of the proletariat, end of quote. David North comments on this in Leon Trotsky and the Struggle for Socialism in the 21st Century. Quote, with these words, Trotsky summed up not only the situation as it existed in 1938, but also the central political problem of modern history. The objective prerequisites, i.e. the international development of the productive forces, the existence of the revolutionary class, or the replacement of capitalism by socialism were present. But revolution was not merely the automatic outcome of objective economic conditions. It required the politically conscious intervention of the working class in the historical process, based on a socialist program and armed with a clearly elaborated strategic plan. The revolutionary politics of the working class could not be less conscious than the counter-revolutionary politics of the capitalist class it sought to overthrow. Herein lay the historic significance of the Revolutionary Party." End of quote. The founding of the Fourth International was based on scientific and principled considerations. It was rooted in and gave expression to a historical necessity. In the opening section of the transitional program, Trotsky states that the objective prerequisites for a socialist revolution, quote, "have already in general achieved the highest point of fruition that can be reached under capitalism." End of quote. And another quote from the transitional program: "Mankind's productive forces stagnate. Already new inventions and improvements fail to raise the level of material wealth. Conjunctural crises under the conditions of the social crisis of the whole capitalist system inflict ever heavier deprivations and sufferings upon the masses. Growing unemployment, in its turn, deepens the financial crisis of the state and undermines the unstable monetary systems. Democratic regimes, as well as fascist, stagger on from one bankruptcy to another. The bourgeoisie, of course, is aware of this mortal danger to its domination, represented by a new war. But that class is now immeasurably less capable of averting war than on the eve of 1914. All talk to the effect that historical conditions have not yet ripened for socialism is the product of ignorance or conscious deception. The objective prerequisites for the proletarian revolution have not only ripened, they have begun to get somewhat rotten. Without a socialist revolution in the next historical period, at that, a catastrophe threatens the whole culture of mankind. The turn is now to the proletariat, i.e. chiefly to its revolutionary vanguard. The historical crisis of mankind is reduced to the crisis of the revolutionary leadership." End of quote. With this, Trotsky also polemicized against centrist tendencies, which, using all kinds of subjective arguments, rejected the founding of the Fourth International. While the centrists professed to agree with Trotsky's analysis of Stalinism and his political perspective, they considered the founding of the Fourth International either premature or futile or both. One of their main arguments was that the Trotskyist movement was too small and too isolated to proclaim a new international. A new party could only emerge from great events. Trotsky replied, quote, "The Fourth International has already arisen out of great events, the greatest defeats of the proletariat in history. The cause of these defeats is to be found in the degeneration and perfidy of the old leadership. The class struggle does not tolerate interruption. The Third International, following the Second, is dead for purposes of revolution. Long live the Fourth International." But has the time yet arrived to proclaim its creation? The skeptics are not quieted down. The Fourth International, we answer, has no need of being proclaimed. It exists and it fights. It is weak? Yes, its ranks are not numerous because it is still young. They are as yet chiefly cadres. But these cadres are pledges to the future. Outside of these cadres, there does not exist a single revolutionary current on this planet, really meriting the name. If our international be still weak in numbers, it is strong in doctrine, program, tradition, in the incomparable tempering of its cadre. Who does not perceive this today, let him in the meantime stand aside. Tomorrow it will become more evident. End of quote. As the Socialist Equality Party states in its historical foundations, the history of the 20th century, quote, would prove the correctness of the assessment of the Fourth International as the only genuinely revolutionary leadership, end of quote. The decisive task of our epoch was to overcome the gap between the maturity of the objective situation and the political maturity of the working class and its vanguard. In order to achieve this strategic goal, the transitional program developed a number of economic and political demands. A sliding scale of wages, the nationalization of industry, the banks and agriculture, the arming of the proletariat, the formation of a workers' and peasants' government. These transitional demands were meant to build a bridge between the consciousness of the working class and the ultimate revolutionary task they confronted, the conquest of power by the proletariat. The demands had one central goal: the development of the revolutionary consciousness of the working class. They were not meant at all as a justification for opportunist maneuvers or the adaptation to the existing consciousness of workers. Quote, "The program must express the objective tasks of the working class rather than the backwardness of the workers," end of quote, Trotsky stressed. And another quote, "It must reflect society as it is and not the backwardness of the working class. It is an instrument to overcome and vanquish the backwardness," end of quote. It is a historical fact that only the Trotskyist movement understood the character of the Second World War and fought to arm the working class with a clear understanding of the situation and the necessary program to counterpose to the war map of the bourgeoisie the map of the class struggle for the proletarian world revolution. This was not a question of advancing a few radical slogans. Rather, it required the constant defense of Marxism, and on this basis, the development of a revolutionary leadership and cadre. In his essay, Trotsky's Last Year, David North provides a powerful overview of the intense work of Trotsky and the Fourth International in the immediate aftermath of its founding. Particularly significant was Trotsky's famous Last Struggle against the minority faction in the American Socialist Workers' Party, led by James Burnham, Max Shechtman, and Martin Abern. They reacted to the signing of the Hitler-Stalin Pact in August 1939 by revoking the designation of the Soviet Union as a degenerated worker state. And this was not simply a semantic question of what words should be used to characterize the Soviet state. As David North writes, the dispute, quote, anticipated many of the most difficult questions of revolutionary strategy, program, and perspective that were to arise during and in the aftermath of the Second World War, end of quote. At stake were the most fundamental questions of perspective and method: the assessment of the epoch as an epoch of socialist revolution, the role of the working class as a revolutionary force capable of building a socialist society, the character of the October Revolution, and that of the Soviet bureaucracy, as well as the Marxist method. Was the bureaucracy a parasitic caste whose dominant and reactionary role was a result of the backwardness and isolation of the Soviet Union and the international defeats of the working class? Or was it a new exploiting class, whose emergence Marxism had not foreseen? The positions of Burnham, Shechtman, and Abern essentially repudiated the October Revolution and the entire socialist project. They reflected and anticipated a sharp shift to the right of a whole layer of middle-class professors and intellectuals, whose principal conclusion from the defeats of the working class was that the working class and Marxism had failed, not that the leadership had betrayed. In his very last article, The Class, the Party, and the Leadership, Trotsky dealt precisely with this issue and characterized those who sought to unload the defeat of the Spanish Revolution on the working masses. Quote, "This impotent philosophy, which seeks to reconcile defeats as a necessary link in the chain of cosmic developments, is completely incapable of posing and refuses to pose the question of such concrete factors as programs, parties, personalities that were the organizers of defeat. This philosophy of fatalism and prostration is diametrically opposed to Marxism as the theory of revolutionary action." End of quote. Under conditions of war and the betrayals of Stalinism, these impotent philosophers shifted sharply to the right and became a new and unabashed basis of support for capitalism and imperialism. In the case of Burnham and Schachmann, this evolution was particularly stark. While the former became an advocate of preemptive nuclear war against the USSR and principal neoconservative ideologist, the latter became a political advisor to the anti-communist AFL-CIO bureaucracy and supported criminal imperialist operations and wars, such as the CIA-orchestrated Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba and the US bombing of North Vietnam. In his essay, North notes that, to the surprise of Burnham and Schachmann, Trotsky introduced the question of dialectical logic into the discussion. Burnham, a professor of philosophy at New York University, rejected the dialectical method outright. Schachmann declared that he did not care about philosophical issues and was not particularly interested in considering the relation of dialectical materialism to revolutionary politics. But Trotsky insisted on the significance of the dialectic as a method to analyze and understand objective reality for the purpose of revolutionary action. North further elaborates on the significant point. Quote, "The development of a scientific perspective necessary for the political orientation of the working class required a level of analysis of a complex, contradictory, and therefore rapidly changing socio-economic and political situation that could not be acquired on the basis of formal logic diluted with pragmatic impressionism. The absence of scientific method, for all his pretensions to philosophical expertise, found crude expression in the manner in which Burnham's analysis of Soviet society and policies was devoid of historical content and based largely on impressionistic descriptions of phenomena visible on the surface of society. Burnham's pragmatic common sense approach to complex socio-economic and political processes was theoretically worthless. He contrasted the existing Soviet Union to what he thought, in ideal terms, a genuine worker state should be. He did not seek to explain the historical process and conflict of social and political forces on a national and international scale, which underlay the degeneration." End of quote. On the basis of the defense of this historical, philosophical, and political method, that is Marxism, Trotsky and the Fourth International were able to analyze the character of the Second World War and develop the perspective of world socialist revolution. The manifesto of the Fourth International on imperialist war, adopted by the Emergency Conference of the Fourth International, held on May 19 to May 9, 2026 in 1940, explained the imperialist character of the Second World War, stating, quote, "It derived its origin inexorably from the contradictions of international capitalist interests. Contrary to the official fables designed to drug the people, the chief cause of war, as of all other social evils, unemployment, the high cost of living, fascism, colonial oppression, is the private ownership of the means of production, together with the bourgeois state, which rests on this foundation." End of quote. However, so long as the main productive forces of society were held by isolated capitalist cliques, quote, "and so long as the national state remains a pliant tool in the hands of these cliques, the struggle for markets, for sources of raw materials, for domination of the world must inevitably assume a more and more destructive character. State power and domination of the economy can be torn from the hands of these rapacious imperialist cliques only by the revolutionary working class." End of quote. David North explains in his essay that Trotsky was seeking to orient the Fourth International on the longer-term perspective and prepare the cadre for a whole new stage in the crisis of the capitalist system and world revolution. Quote, "The capitalist world has no way out unless a prolonged death agony is so considered. It is necessary to prepare for long years, if not decades, of war, uprisings, brief interludes of truce, new wars, and new uprisings, end of quote, the manifesto of the Fourth International emphasized. In a section titled The Problem of Leadership, the statement stressed, quote, a young revolutionary party must base itself on this perspective. History will provide it with enough opportunities and possibilities to test itself, to accumulate experience, and to mature. The swifter the ranks of the vanguard are fused, to the more the epoch of bloody convulsions will be shortened. The less destruction will our planet suffer. But the great historical problem will not be solved in any case until a revolutionary party stands at the head of the proletariat. The question of tempos and time intervals is of enormous importance, but it alters neither the general historical perspective nor the direction of our policy. The conclusion is a simple one. It is necessary to carry on the work of educating and organizing the proletarian vanguard with tenfold energy. Precisely in this lies the task of the Fourth International. End of quote. The whole record of the ICFI, which we will review at this school, is proof that the Trotskyist movement lived up to this task. Now, under conditions of a rapidly developing new period of war and revolution, which we defined as the fifth phase in the history of the Trotskyist movement, this work of, quote, educating and organizing the proletarian vanguard, end of quote, has to be intensified once again. As Comrade North stated in his introductory remarks to an SEP aggregate meeting in June 2023, and that's the conclusion of the lecture, we are determined that in the developing period of mass working class struggles, our party will be able to provide a revolutionary response and revolutionary program to the working class. But for that to take place, our cadre must be familiar with the historical experiences, the struggle over fundamental questions of perspective and program. In other words, the cadre must understand what separates our movement from every other political tendency. Why our movement alone, no other movement, represents the historical continuity of the struggle for Marxism. That continuity is, I think, that's Comrade North, exemplified in the title of the latest book to come out, Leon Trotsky and the Struggle for Socialism in the 21st Century. Our particular conception of Trotskyism is that all of historical experience has established that the future development of socialism as a mass revolutionary movement will be based upon the political legacy of Leon Trotsky, as that legacy has been developed through the work of the International Committee of the Fourth International over the last 60 years. All the historical experience of the Marxist movement demonstrates that that is the indispensable basis for genuine revolutionary work. Thank you very much, comrades.